This panel presentation is on Japanese newspaper coverage of the world, and I will be moderating, and I'm very happy to be able to have Virgil Hawkins of the University of Osaka and the IAFOR Research Center here with us, and also Nobuyuki Okumura from Musashi University in Japan. And I'll just do a short introduction, and then we will get the ball rolling on this. So in your conference programs, on page 38 to 39, you have a background to these presenters, but I'm just going to introduce them here now. And Virgil Hawkins, who is a colleague of mine and directs the IAFOR Research Center, is a professor specializing in world affairs and the news media, and he's based at the Osaka School of International Public Policy, OSIP, at the University of Osaka, Japan. He obtained his PhD in International Public Policy from OSIP, where he focused on international politics, conflict, the UN Security Council, and the news media. He proceeded to work for 5 years for a non-governmental aid organization, so primarily in Cambodia and Zambia, before returning to the university as a faculty member. He has written and edited a number of books, including Stealth Conflicts, How the World's Worst Violence is Ignored, 2008. That could do with an updated version, because it's not gone away. And Communication and Peace, Mapping an Emerging Field, co-edited in 2015. His work focuses on furthering our understanding of how and why the vast majority of the world remains relatively uncovered by the news media. To these ends, Professor Hawkins has since shifted his focus to work at a more practical level. He co-established the Southern African Center for Collaboration on Peace and Security in 2010, a network that has brought together researchers and practitioners working on these issues throughout the region. He went on to establish Global News View, GNV, a large-scale media project that analyzes trends and deficiencies in the world news coverage by the Japanese news media and attempts to compensate for those deficiencies by providing analysis on undercovered global issues. And we collaborate at the IAFOR Research Center with this Global News View project. And we had an IAFOR fellow last year assigned to Professor Hawkins' center. So please join me in welcoming Professor Hawkins. To my left, I have Professor Nobuyuki Okumura, a professor in the Faculty of Sociology at Musashi University in Japan, and he's been teaching within the Department of Media Sociology there since 2014. His research interests include journalism, politics and media ethics, and digital journalism fact-checking. He earned a master's degree in international relations from Sophia University in Tokyo in 1989, and later joined the news division of TV Asahi, working as a producer for its news station program. He also served as a reporter in the station's political news and editing departments. Professor Okumura has been a visiting scholar at the Edwin O. Reischauer Center for East Asian Studies, within the Paul H. Nitze School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins, and professor in the College of Social Sciences at Ritsumeikan University in Japan. Please join me in welcoming Professor Okumura. Unfortunately, our third panelist, Reiko Tsuchiya, is not available to make it today because, unfortunately, she is unwell. So we send her our good wishes, and we will go on regardless and allocate that time to the other panelists. So the abstract that I'll read out here, it's in the program, but is Japanese newspaper coverage of the world. So you've got to focus on the local. The major Japanese broadsheet newspapers in circulation today have a history spanning 150 years. Unlike many of their Western counterparts, these leading newspapers tend to operate at a national rather than a city level. While they primarily focus on domestic issues, they also allocate a certain amount of page space to world news and maintain a network of foreign bureaus. But how do they choose to cover the world? it is reasonable to assume a strong home lens in which countries, regions, and events perceived as impacting Japan's national interests are prioritized. We can assume that powerful Western countries exert influence on what is reported. However, long-term research on how Japanese newspapers cover world affairs remains limited, and our understanding of broader trends in coverage is still developing. So this panel examines how Japanese newspapers construct and prioritize their coverage of the world with attention to both historical and contemporary patterns. By bringing together new research on the international orientation of the press, this panel seeks to highlight how domestic concerns, geopolitical pressures, and broader media transformations intersect to shape reporting choices. And we'll be structuring the panel as follows. Professor Hawkins will speak, and then Professor Okumura will speak, and then I'll invite comments for both of them to comment on each other's presentations, and then we'll open up first of all to questions, and then to the floor to you for any questions that you might have. So that's basically the structure of what we'll do for the next 50 minutes or so. So I'll give the microphone to Professor Hawkins and allow you to get on with your presentation.
Thanks very much. Dr. Haldane. Yeah, so we, as was just mentioned, we were supposed to have a third speaker who is going to speak about the history of Japanese media from the perspective of newspapers. Unfortunately, we don't have that, and I don't think either of us can replace that presentation. But just to sort of try to connect it a little bit, one of the things that I'm going to speak about is the decline in coverage by Japanese newspapers over the last couple of decades. And so unfortunately, I can't cover a historical period beyond that. But just to give one moment to speak in historical terms, I did once have a chance to look at the very first edition of the Asahi Shimbun, one of the leading Japanese newspapers. So the very first one in the 1800s, it's like 150 years ago. I had a chance to see the actual newspaper, and I just checked how many of these stories are world news, like day one of this newspaper in the 1800s. And I found it to be relatively similar in proportion to what it is now, which says that perhaps globalization has not made much of a major impact on Japan in recent years. It might be even the reverse. But let me leave it the historical topic at that. Today I'm going to talk about tracing the decline in world media coverage in Japanese newspapers, but I also want to address the issue of determinants of world coverage, which is going to help us understand a little better. I'll start by saying that the proportion of world news coverage that we see today, it's roughly about 10% in the Japanese newspapers, and this is the same for TV. It's also the same for online news, pretty much. So if you open a newspaper, if you watch a news program, roughly 90% is going to be about issues in Japan, and about 10% about everything outside of Japan. Sports news, by the way, is getting about 20%. So you will know a lot more about sports than you will about the rest of the world in Japanese newspapers. So now let me shift just for a moment to the issue of proportion, distribution globally of the media attention, because this is going to also give us a little bit of an idea when we think about determinants. This is based on a study, a 10-year study. Dr. Haldane mentioned Global News View, GNV, this organization that I run together with my students. We spend all day long just measuring what the Japanese media is talking about in its world news coverage, and we've done it for 10 years. So we have basically 10 years worth of data of the 3 leading newspapers. We just sort of wrapped up in the last couple of months this data, we put it together, and this is one of our conclusions. So this is a world map, it's a heat map. It shows you have 10 degrees of color to tell you how much coverage each region of the world got. I don't think, in hindsight, I don't think we needed 10 degrees of color. As you can see, basically either your country is covered massively or it really isn't covered at all. For example, the top 3 countries that are covered, surprise, surprise, the US, followed by China, and then followed by Japan. And I say Japan because we also measure Japan's appearance in foreign news coverage. If, for example, the Japanese Prime Minister meets with the US President, we'll count that as international news and we'll split it in half. So half of that coverage will be America, half of it will be Japan. So Japan turns up in the international news quite regularly, as you would imagine. But if we put these 3 together, the US, China, and Japan, they make up more than 40% of international news coverage as a whole. So we have this really high concentration on a select small number of countries. Of course, you can see there's a bit of color in Russia and Ukraine. There's a little bit of color in some other places. But over the course of 10 years, we have this really serious concentration. So the African continent, for example, will not get more than 3%, more likely to get 2% of coverage in the Japanese media. So you will very rarely see anything from Africa in a Japanese newspaper. Okay, so we also spent a bit of time looking at determinants, and this is the kind of things that we found. If a country has a higher population, it's more likely to get covered. If a country is closer geographically, it's more likely to get covered. What was a little bit surprising is that the levels of trade don't seem to impact coverage. So we would expect that if a country has closer economic ties, we would expect more coverage. That's not really the case. It would seem that the levels of trade between Japan and that country do not have a major impact, which made us think about other factors. And one factor we found is the poverty headcount. If your country is poorer or has a high percentage of people in poverty, you're less likely to get covered. They're interested in concentrations in wealth. And then also, I think this is very interesting from the perspective of Japan, is that they're constantly looking at what the US media is covering. So what is the New York Times looking at today? What is the BBC looking at today? They'll take those and they'll, I mean, sorry, BBC is not the US, but you get the picture. It's your powerful Western countries. What they are focusing on is going to have an impact on what the Japanese media is focusing on. And so we just looked at the New York Times, and we found that there is, in fact, a relationship between what the New York Times is focusing on in the world and what Japan is focusing on in the world. So this is sort of like what we've been working on for quite a long time, trying to look at trends and then trying to look at the determinants. But we have done another study in the last couple of months that I'm also going to share with you. And I'll go into this with a colleague of mine in a little bit more detail in a panel tomorrow if you're interested in learning more. But this is a further trend that we've been looking at. And that is the decline in the amount of coverage of the world over the past couple of decades. A number of years ago, we looked at the Asahi Shimbun. We looked at that from the end of the Cold War up until the present. More recently, we've looked at the Yomiuri. So this is the leading Japanese newspaper, the Yomiuri. We looked at that from 2000 up until the present. And this is just the total number of articles about the world. And you can see this decline over the years. I'll ask you to please ignore anything after 2018 because they kind of changed the way that they measure. They changed. So they used to have like sports news included in the international news. So if like a Japanese baseball player is doing something, it would get a lot of coverage in world news. But they removed it after 2018. So that you can see this big drop. This is you remove sports from the equation and you get this drop after 2018. So let's just look at from like 2000 up until 2018. You can see it. You can see a pretty serious decline there in coverage of the world. And we found the same thing in Asahi. Now, there was a pretty serious decline in world news coverage in the US media but this was seen mostly after the Cold War, the end of the Cold War. In Japan, the trend was a little bit different. We saw this decline mostly after the year 2000, especially in the first 10 years, from 2000 to about 2010. This is when we saw this big decline. Now, we don't have any serious evidence about why this is the case, and maybe my colleague, Professor Okumura, can add a little bit to this, but I would suspect it's a decline in the business model, the lack of funding, the increasing lack of funding because of online news. But anyway, that's something I think we can get to in the discussion. But there is another thing here that also backs that up, and this will be my final slide, is that it's not only the world news coverage that is declining. So you can see that at relatively similar rate, there is a slight decline in the proportion, but basically the issue here is that the news as a whole is declining. So the number of articles that the newspapers are producing as a whole is decreasing. So this yellow line shows the total number of articles in the Yomiuri Shimbun newspaper, the total number of articles, and the blue line shows the world news articles. And so both of them are in decline. The line graph, the gray line graph, shows the percentage. And again, please ignore anything after 2018. But basically, we can see that the decline in international news is being accompanied by a decline in news quantity in general. We then also sort of looked at the physical newspaper itself. We counted the number of pages. So compared to from the year 2000 to the year 2004, we saw a 24% decline in the number of pages in the newspaper itself. So the news, as the quantity of news that is being produced is declining fairly significantly over the last 2 or so decades. And so two problems here, as I said. We have the issue of the low levels of coverage in general and the distribution, geographical distribution, but also the fact that the levels of news in general are in decline. Or have been in decline. And I guess it's a trend that we might expect to see in the future. Hopefully not, but I will leave my presentation here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And we'll just go straight on then to your presentation, and then we can fuse and ask some questions.
Okay. Let me add what he said. I mean, physically, that the number of the articles that Japanese newspapers are in decline right now because the size of the letters getting bigger and bigger in these 10 years, I'd say, for the adjustment for the older generation. That's one of the reasons why that the number of the articles is in decline before. It's great to be a member of this panel here, and it's also nice to meet you, everybody. Thank you. And how do you?
Just press that button. Yeah.
Okay. I appreciate those efforts of presentation at Haldane and Marina and other staff members of the IAFOR Research Center. Please allow me to introduce myself briefly. I used to work at one of the major Japanese national news outlets, and TV Asahi, covering politics, diplomacy, and security. I am now researching journalism, politics, media, and media ethics, and fact-checking, also teaching video journalism and digital storytelling right now. Before talking, I'd like you to take a look at the short video made through Sora 2. The views from windows of the high-rise apartment represents the scope of Japanese news consumers. Coverage of the war in Ukraine and Gaza is smaller. Intensive focus on North Korea, particularly on the military buildups. Far more resources are devoted covering the United States and China. However, regarding news in the US, the situation is quite unique. News is almost on Donald Trump. Japanese news consumers know what he said in Air Force One today, but do not know much about government shutdown, nor about an ACA, Affordable Care Act is in peril, and lots of protests. Nowadays, very strange situation has been going on too. Major League Baseball, especially Los Angeles Dodgers, is regarded as a part of the hard news. A lot of airing time on newspaper space is spent on Shohei Ohtani and Yoshinobu Yamamoto. The names of Jimmy Kimmel and Stephen Colbert hardly heard of. Thus, this is surely an important issue in terms of freedom of speech in the United States and world. I'm trying to explain the reason why such a biased news coverage developed. I am not sure where I should begin with, and it is very chicken and egg situation. Let me start with the consumer side. News consumers in Japan are not so interested in foreign news with a few exceptions. Their weak interests in war in Ukraine and Middle East represented on the background. Media merely provided news on brutality of battles or military developments on each day, without background explanations, long history of conflict, nor neither the international efforts of those 20, 30 years at all. Therefore, readers skip such news. Lots of smartphone users swipe and turn to another news pieces. Turning to the media side. Japanese news media know how difficult to coordinate background explanations within limited volume of news pieces, and they tend to avoid in-depth stories. The number of foreign bureaus declined sharply. Majority of news outlets have closed significant numbers of offices since about these 20 years, I would say, mainly in Middle East, Eastern and Central Europe, Africa, and South America. Number of correspondents also have declined accordingly. That leads to a shortage of experts of the regions. Maybe you have noticed that TV reporters appears on today's Japanese TV featured stories do not report the whole story or explain much. Instead, they only speak 10 seconds on-camera comments. It's like an alibi that the representatives from the news outlet is there anyway. Likewise in newspapers, reporters tend to report side stories, relying mainline stories on AP, Reuters, and or major international news outlets. I think there is an appropriate size of staffers for sufficient coverage of news events. You cannot listen carefully to the press conference and report or write news stories at the same time. You need multiple number of reporters. Reporting internationally is more challenging. Time difference, transportation, and other logistics things. Then the kind of negative cycle of spiral occurs. News media provides superficial coverage for consumers. Consumers get only limited understanding, and they hardly have further interests. As news media continues the same practice, making news consumers less and less interested in what is happening in the world. So it's happening in Japan in these, I would say, 30 years, 40 years. The biggest reason is the language, the peculiarity of Japanese language. It's really hard for them to translate it to the Japanese consumers, I'm sure. The downturn of media economy causes a reduction of coverage resources, which makes news stories less informative and attractive. The change of news storytelling is also a reason. Nowadays, in both newspapers and TV news, production of news stories become more and more collaborative. It is very uncommon for one reporter writes a full piece. I could add that the traditional division of sections within newsrooms has been worsening the problem in Japan. Such division makes certain coverage of global issues difficult, such as climate change, HIV, landmines, etc. because the Japanese media traditionally separated the politics, economy, city news, international, and so on very strictly, and they don't interact each other. Those issues are very cross-sectional, and nobody takes a leadership in the organization at all. Such decisions are risky to achieve more short-term appreciations for the reporters and the news desks. In fact, I cannot think of any persuasive remedies yet. Digital transformation of news media might enable new styles of reporting. Digital storytelling, mixture of text, photos, videos, and graphics in one story, optimizing for smartphones or other digital devices, and this may make the news more enjoyable to read. Some survey, like the Pew Research Center results, tells that the news consumers generally do not like long-term stories. But that trend could have changed. The trend of the digital optimization of news might open doors for news media presenting background explanations through different approaches, which could contribute further interest. Another remedy might be more collaboration, as you could find a field where media could work together without losing diversity. One of the good examples is fact-checking. You cannot make a difference about mere reporting about facts. However, Japanese media are not good at collaboration at all. They still insist they are competing each other. So we might need some other stronger measures. I don't know. Thank you very much.
I'll invite Professor. I'll use a microphone because it's a media conference. I'll invite Professor Hawkins to give feedback on that presentation, and then I'll invite you to make any comments you might have on his before then opening it up.
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, no, just a simple question. That AI video, you made that?
I did.
And then what were your prompts? What were your keywords?
Okay. Using Lego minifigs and having the kind of battles like tanks and soldiers that's very far in the background, and a military parade of the North Korean uniformed soldiers in the front. And then, the Sora does not accept Donald Trump and other, the names.
Oh, okay.
So the very very tall, old white guy with curly blonde hair.
Okay, got it. Sorry.
The balloons is, coming from the left side or something like that.
Got it. No, I for a
with
moment.
Big hands.
Okay. No. For a moment there, I thought you just asked it to do an overview of Japanese media coverage, and that was the okay, I got it.
So it doesn't have anything to do with it.
Got it. But I agree, it's quite an accurate description because, yes, in terms of conflict, yes, the Japanese media only seems to acknowledge that conflict is happening in Ukraine and Gaza. It doesn't know about the conflict in the Sudan or the Congo or other places. Okay, then my other question is about the issue of collaboration. So, I totally understand the point that you make about the difficulties and that I think especially the major national news organizations, I don't think they have a sense of crisis about the situation they are in at the moment. But I thought, I also agree that collaboration would be a really good idea. And I'm looking, for example, about the African continent where you have the major news organizations only have one person in Johannesburg, and then they've got one person in Cairo. And the person in Cairo is basically looking at the Middle East. So basically the whole of Africa is being covered by one person in Johannesburg. And so I thought, well, if each of these news organizations are going to have just one person there, why don't they put somebody in Nairobi, put somebody in Lagos or somewhere else, and then just split the news? Because I understand that kind of competition politically, like especially domestically, it'll be really difficult because they have their own political stances on issues. But in faraway foreign places, I think collaboration in theory could work. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, actually, that I don't know. Some 16 major news outlets in Japan have very strong pride that they could manage themselves, and they have a long history, and no outlets have gone bankruptcy at all yet. I cannot say yet, but maybe in the future, but not yet. So their kind of sense of crisis is very weak yet, and then whenever we discuss about the collaboration that they cite the kind of editorial rights of each company, and they really think it important. But what is editorial rights, and what the editorial rights are affected in each story, but they don't discuss that details much. So the negotiation stops in the at the entrance every time. I would say.
Thank you. Thank you.
Would you like to ask any questions of Virgil, of Professor Hawkins, in his...
I think you had better to present some topics, and we could...
Okay, well, yeah. I'd like to throw the first one then around... You gave us a great overview of, like, this is the situation here, this is the situation within Japan, and we see this one country, America, obviously having... taking a great deal of attention, and then I guess you could spill it out into America's wars, or sort of a secondary attention. How different is this in other contexts? So you've given us the Japanese. Does this differ in the UK? Does it differ in Africa, for example? Or are we going to see roughly the same sort of percentages in terms of domestic coverage and foreign coverage?
Thank you. Yeah, so a number of studies that I've looked at in terms of coverage, so in terms of percentage of world coverage, let's say, we're looking in Japan at roughly 10%. Some studies that I've seen about US media, British media, Belgian media, they were coming out at about 15, 16%. Now, the way you measure it makes a big difference, so I don't know how comparable they are, but I'm pretty sure we'll have a slightly higher proportion of world coverage in other media. In terms of the geographical proportion, this is like a study that I did a couple of decades ago, so I don't know how well it holds up now. But for example, I mean, I keep focusing on Africa, but let me just stay with that. I did a study, for example, of BBC, CNN, Le Monde, New York Times, and their coverage of Africa was between about 6 and 8%. Whereas in Japan it's between 2 and 3%. So I think we see a little bit more diversity, a little bit more room for other continents in Western media compared to the Japanese media. And then, okay, African media, I think it's really mixed. So one of the most popular Zambian media newspapers that used to exist, I did a study of them. And it was so westernized. I mean, there was so little coverage of the African continent. They were just so focused on Zambia, and then even very little coverage of their neighbors, because they were just bringing in, they didn't have their own foreign correspondents, they were just bringing in the news feed from elsewhere, and they weren't really too excited about it. Having said that, in other countries, you might find a newspaper that has the local domestic coverage, and then it will have an African page, and then it will have the other world. So it really depends. I think it's quite mixed. But yeah, I mean, it's the world, so yes, very mixed, yeah.
So this connects with one of the things that you were talking about in terms of what's covered in the agenda. And we know that, for example, people are interested in something, as you said, and so they want to know more about it. But the only way in which they could become interested in something is if it's introduced on the agenda. And so you see that with the baseball. It's that people are interested in baseball, and it's a circular thing. You provide them more. It's a safe way of knowing that attention is going to be drawn. So there's can you say something about you've said it as a negative cycle. Are there any ways in which you believe it can be addressed in ways of putting things on the agenda that show more of the world to more people, make them more interested in more things? Is that possible, or is that not the role of a newspaper?
It's a tough question. I think nowadays the newspapers or the news media generally have been losing such a power, to the extra power, I would say, to make the topics more interesting and attractive. Because it's one of the reasons is economy. They are losing the experts. And the losing experts, the reason why is that kind of training systems of reporters. And you have to move all the parts. I mean, the general newspaper reporter starts at a very small local city and covering police. And after 1 year, they move to the city council. And after 2 years or so, they move to some other bigger cities, like in the prefectures, the main prefecture city, and then covers police and other governmental sections for, I would say, 3 or 4 years. And after some 10 years, and some good reporters are recruited to the central bureau of the newspapers. But after that, they moved to other places like every 2 years. So when I was staying at the Kisha clubs, the longest stay in my Kisha club.
What's a Kisha club?
Kisha club is a press club, and then each government section, the branches, have the press club, and then all the 16, 17, and medias, national medias, and plus some other, like in the BBC and New York Times and foreign medias, have an access to that place. And then the longest period I stayed was 8 months or something. And I moved to the places all the time. That doesn't make them experts at all. So that really makes it really hard to expand the topic, and expand the interest of the
So I want to just perhaps you can say a little more on the Kisha Club and on this, precisely on this movement. So in a way, the journalists are placed in low risk environments, like reporting. So police reporting is such and such a thing happened at such and such a time. There's not really too much you can do with that story.
Yeah.
But then when you're a safe pair of hands, and when you know more people, you can move higher. Right. Is that the
right?
Perhaps you can say more then on, because that sounds very cozy.
Well, I mean, but it really is. I think that first year with the police is like a very formative part of a Japanese journalist's career, because it's like you have to go to the police will give you a very limited amount of information, and you have to get more. Sort of like you have to be there when that person's going to go to work in the morning. You're standing outside their house, the police officer, and then try to find a way to get into the same vehicle, and so that you can at least accompany him to his office, so that you can ask him things along the way, and you build trust. And that's how they kind of hone their craft, so to speak, in those early years. But the Kisha Club system is, it's seen as very exclusionary. And I think, although I think there are sort of informal versions of that in other countries, but it's kind of unique to Japan, and that's why they keep the word Kisha, which means reporter, in the name, I guess. But it's basically, so like a major government organization or a or a company will have like an office for the Kisha Club, and you have desks, and only if you're a member, then you can get access to the press conferences and things like that.
So there's a similarity then to the White House, like the briefing
Yeah,
rooms,
that's
the press
right.
rooms,
That's right.
to get the card
Yes,
to access.
that's right. Yeah. But I would just only totally agree with the issue of movement. So, but I think we see this in many other countries as well. I think, the sort of golden age of foreign correspondence, you'd have somebody who would sit there in the same place for 10 years, 20 years, and would develop expertise, would develop a set of contacts and sources of information. But if you're just sort of 2 years and then you move on, then of course the ability to gather that is quite low. And that compared with, and that also on top of that, you've got that issue of when your bureau, for example, has to cover a region. And it's not just Africa. In Asia, you'll have somebody in Thailand who will have to cover a larger region as well. You're going to multiple countries. And then you're there for just, a couple of years and then you're gone. To develop those contacts and that information and expertise over the course of 2 years of a region is just, next to impossible. Yeah. And on top of that, language issue. I think there are a lot of journalists whose maybe their ability to speak in the local language or even English is quite limited, which also makes it difficult.
Can I add something about the Kisha Club issue? One of the biggest problem of the Kisha Club, I would say, is the monopolizing the access. I mean, it's not only the press conferences, but the important part is an informal access of the politicians and the police officers. So kind of private access. I mean, each powerful politician holds a kind of informal talk every day, but nobody knows. And the importance of those talks, and reporters know what's happening next, and where to go, and where they should order to camera to shoot the scene or something. So they monopolize the access, and excluding other freelancers and foreign media, those. So that really kind of makes the news stories uninteresting, because the monopolizing the stories as a very important issue, and not making those stories interesting and attractive to the readers. So it's a kind of inside the force has been working very hard there.
How does that reflect on the Japanese newspaper coverage in terms of foreign stories? Is there a heavy amount of editorializing that goes on, or is there a heavy amount of value judgment, opinion, or is it just simply reported this happened, that happened? And I'm thinking, for example, where you have, particularly in cases of war or conflict, you have usually two major lines, like this is this point of view, this is this point of view. How is it reported? Is it dull and square, or is there a lot of opinion in there?
It depends. I mean, it's up to the personality of the reporters and background and the reporters. But as you go higher in the newspapers, actually the very prestigious newspapers in Japan, that the majority of them from the politics department, the economics department, not the foreign news department, or not the city news department. So they tend to choose the very hard news over economic turns and trends and so on, instead of the poverty or other social issues. So such a kind of bias has been working generally in the very prestigious newspapers.
Okay, so opinion makes it into those.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would add that, I mean, since there is that influence, for example, of the US or Western media, I think those perspectives also come into it. So I think that they're very much under the influence of the Japanese government perspectives as well as Western perspectives. And I think that it looks like it's pure facts, but I mean, of course, you take an angle and that will be in line with that, I think.
Okay. If you don't mind, I'm going to open it up to the floor. We have about 15 minutes. We have a few hands that have gone up. We'll start over there, and I'm going to lose my microphone.
Hi everyone, my name is Nasha. I teach media, specifically sports media. Thank you both for your wonderful presentations. Arguably the greatest living sports person today is not American, and he's not European, and he's not Korean, he is Japanese. And I say arguably the greatest, not just in terms of his achievements in his sport, but also something that Professor Okumura alluded to, and that is his brand and his reputation and how well known Shohei Ohtani is. So my question to Professor Hawkins is, if sports news was re-included in your analysis, what impact would that have on the percentage of sports news since Shohei Ohtani became such a well-known figure?
Thank you. Well, no, I think I kind of agree with the decision to remove. I mean, I definitely agree with the decision to remove sports from international coverage, from being classified as international coverage. Not that that doesn't affect the quantity of coverage at all. It's just a pure classification thing. So it really doesn't matter. But I don't think they can, in all conscience, keep it there, because if I watch a TV program about Major League Baseball, so they just finished the World Series. And if I watch a program on Japanese TV about it, I might not imagine that there are non-Japanese players playing in those teams. This is like the Los Angeles Dodgers, but I might think that the whole of the Los Angeles Dodgers are Japanese because they are the only people that will show. So, I mean, you won't even understand the dynamics within the Los Angeles Dodgers. And you also, further than that, it's not like you will have a better understanding of American politics or culture even from watching those games. You just know how great Shohei Ohtani is. And that's sort of the perspective as well. You know, if you get a voice that is not his, it is a commentator saying how wonderful he is. And it's like, look, even these American greats, these commentators are so, look at how great Shohei Ohtani. So I don't think that makes any, it's just a classification thing, and I don't think it will change our understanding. Yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dr. Sharanya. I teach journalism in Somaya Vidyavihar University, India. So I was totally confused when I saw the picture. My country, India, is nil covered by Japan newspapers, but I can proudly say, human interest point of view, Indian newspapers covers a lot of Japanese stories. I can proudly say even the Baba Vanga story of the tsunami predictions in July was the highest rated story of a human interest in Indian newspaper and also in local channels and newspapers. So we are highly information rich about Japan, but my question is about what is the update or what is the status of alternative media here? Or is there any citizen journalism? Even I want to know about what are the alternative media which is parallelly moving with the traditional ones. Just out of curiosity. Thank you.
Me? The alternative media is really weak because of the powerful Kisha Club system. They monopolize the coverage of all the press conferences and all the government data. So the middle media is really weak. So they rewrite all the news wires or some hires the freelance, very good freelancers who got out of the newspapers, but their stories are really scarce. The one story is a week or something. So I have some good small medias to recommend, but it's really hard for them to have a very continuous news coverage, the constant news coverage at all. That's another reason why the Nikisho Club is really bad in Japan.
Can I just add to that? No, I'm sorry, I have to just say, Global News View that I manage with my students in particular, we are trying to answer that question. So we do stories about India, for example, that the Japanese media might not cover. I mean, the mainstream media, sorry, it's not zero. But just, it looks that color because America is just so powerful. So it really lightens it. But there are stories about India. I think the Japanese media is quite interested in with the relations between Japan and India because of the common interest against China. But yeah, there are, in terms of world news coverage, I think I'd have to recommend Global News View.
Can I ask, in the coverage, do you include, is that anything about Japan? So, for example, if people are writing about cherry blossoms, or would that be included?
In what? Sorry.
In your,
in global
as in foreign coverage, does that count as?
No. Well, we have a very specific.
It's news.
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, no. Well, I mean, it could be a very fluffy story, but if it's happening in Japan, it won't be counted as world news.
Okay. Because I was going to say, quite often when you see UK news on Japan, it'll be sort of cherry blossoms, samurai, sexual deviancy. You know, like just sort of. The sort of stuff that's quite evergreen and not really news, yeah. But they know people will respond to, because that's the stereotype, and that's what they sort of want to see and hear.
Yeah, the quality of information is a totally different story. Yeah.
And you don't yet have a a qualityometer or something.
No, we don't.
Okay.
Thanks a lot, Trevor from the University of South Africa in South Africa. I also want to register a grievance that I didn't see any coverage of the continent from your research, because I think we consume a lot of news coming from Asia, but maybe this connects to my question, because in many cases what we read about Asia and other part of the world is basically coming from wires, Reuters, from your Voice of America. So in many cases, you find that even in the way in which we frame the world, because I used to work as a reporter, it's based on the channel through which we read the world from. And often there's a sense that we almost get entangled in all these global fights because our coverage of these, the developments based on the narratives that you get from the media, and the fact that, there's no such a thing as objective journalism. It could be factual if you want to argue, but it's based on selection, because selection, when news is value, it has value, right? It's not value-led, it's value-led, and it's based on who owns such a media house. I would want you to reflect, and I think I'm going to use this as a case study for one of my classes, on issues around objectivity, impartiality, and just how much the political climate of the media, media ownership and things like that actually impacts on media or journalism as a whole, because you cannot think about who owns a certain media house when you look at the way in which they frame these stories.
So it's around ownership.
Basically.
So
yes.
how does that break down in Japan? How's your media owned? Who owns your media?
The media ownership thing affects the narratives of the news. Not much. I mean, in Japan, the kind of ownership doesn't matter. Not important, because it's like a very ordinary company. So it doesn't affect the narratives, I would say. Rather that I don't know. But historically, that there are two categories of the very conservative national newspapers and rather liberal media. And then television doesn't matter because there is a cross-ownership in Japan. So each television, the commercial broadcasters connect to the very attached to the one newspaper each. So there are 6 major newspapers and 6 networks working together. So there are some 13, 14 newspapers, but then I would say there are 6 company groups. So the 2 of them, the Yomiuri and Sankei, are really conservative and ultranational. They don't like China. They don't like North Korea. And then the other 4 are rather liberal or the middle. So, but then the ownership doesn't matter. But then the editorial leadership changes. But then the editorial leadership people are really important. And then actually the Yomiuri, the biggest newspaper, and a very powerful person called Mr. Watanabe is in the leadership with more than 40 years. He has been the main editor and then a company president for more than 40 years and occupies and the controls and narratives, I would say. And he also advises to the prime ministers, because when he was a young political reporter, that he worked with later powerful prime ministers to work together then powerful politicians to work together to train that politicians. So he affects to the actual national policy too. So the company ownership doesn't matter in Japan, but the personality of the one reporter and the background of those reporters sometimes affects the narratives and then sometimes occupies the whole company. But it depends. So it doesn't have a pattern, I would say.
Thank you.
Yeah, sorry. I mean, I would argue that it does have an influence in, not as I think as the professor just said, I think it doesn't matter on particular brands, but I think if we consider the propaganda model, for example, I think that definitely we can see that in the Japanese media. So just a very general protection of power and wealth by the newspapers, by their very nature as large-scale conglomerates themselves. And we've done a few studies on this, and to keep it close to home for you, I'm sure the scandal, the power plant scandal going back, 10, 15 years ago with Hitachi trying to build, and the ANC, they were giving money to the ANC. So that particular scandal, I looked at the coverage of that scandal in the Japanese media, pretty much zero. So this was a big scandal in South Africa. In the Japanese media, and it was Hitachi, a major Japanese corporation, they didn't touch it. It was only after that the U.S. Security and Exchanges Committee, it was only when the U.S. picked it up, the Japanese media gave it like a tiny little article, and that was that. And I think that has something to do with the business interest alignment between Japan and the media.
Okay, we've got 2 minutes, so this is going to be the last question.
Thank you very much. As a typical academic, I'm going to make a comment rather than ask a question. My name is Rensha, I'm from South Africa, the University of the Free State. And the way that I consume media or news has changed considerably in the last year, because in South Africa, at the end of 2024, all except one of the Afrikaans newspapers closed. So we had more than 400 journalists in South Africa lose their job at the end of 2024. So I don't get my national news anymore because the newspaper's closed. So I am consuming more international news because I don't have a local or not a national newspaper anymore. But as an academic who works in the communication science department, I've also now noticed that we are seeing a decrease in the amount of students who want to study journalism because they know that there aren't any newspapers to work for anymore, so they are not going to have a job. The only space for a lot of them to go work in would then be at an international newspaper.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so that's an interesting point that I think people from many countries can sympathise with, that a lot of our attention is directed towards the US and what's going on in those contexts, to the detriment of our domestic news. Okay, well, thank you very much, Professor Hawkins, Professor Okumura, for that, and I'm sure there will be plenty of questions that people have and will be able to pick up. But I think that was a really good sort of little window opening on the Japanese media, and I look forward to continuing to work with you on Global News View to indeed be able to expand that to fulfill its remit and engage with the IAFOR community. Thank you very much, both of you. Thank you.